The Beatles with Take 3 of Fixing a Hole, one of the many, many heretofore unreleased recordings, which came out this past summer on the deluxe 6-disc 50th anniversary edition of the group's classic 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Here to talk about that album and the events of that seminal year in music, and how it changed the Beatles while they were affecting change, is Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be here as always.
You know, it was only a few years ago that we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Beatles coming to America, and I remember at the time that there were reports from Apple insiders about some reluctance to acknowledge those 50 years, fearing that it made the Beatles seem old to young listeners. But this time around, no such reluctance at all. I mean, everywhere you turn, it's, hey, the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love.
Yeah, well, it seems like a sort of natural media event that was going to get attention anyway, and that distinguished it from the last year, with the 50th of Revolver.
Right.
There was no Summer of Love to hang it on. So you could see where if they don't have to do the heavy lifting and the media is already going to be, buzzing about the events of 67, that's half their battle. It's going to be talked about anyway. Why not ride that wave?
Well, let's get right into this. You're right. There was nothing done last year to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Revolver. And that album is widely considered the Beatles' best album today in 2017. It was the last time that the Beatles were on the road and sharing hotel rooms and basically living in each other's pockets. So there was kind of a group mind at work on Revolver, with everybody contributing towards the same goal, and it's sort of fractured on Pepper.
I totally agree with that. And you sort of intuit things as a listener,
right,
that maybe later on after the fact you find out what the backstory is, and you're like, oh, that's why. And I do remember my earliest impressions of Pepper, which would have been in the mid-'70s, so it wasn't like I experienced it in the Summer of Love, which was a whole different thing for the people that were there.
Right.
And so I'm experiencing it as a listener, and I listened to it all the way through as a start-to-finish listening experience. But there was something about it that I couldn't quite articulate at the time that struck me as being sort of self-conscious. Like
right,
there was all this artifice being projected in a way that was not the usual way on a Beatle record. And then, of course, you get into the backstory of, they created this alter ego, they were going to be Sgt. Pepper's Band, and really, if there's any concept to that album, it's certainly not a narrative thread. It may be, we're going to record this collection of songs as un-Beatly as possible. Maybe that's what the whole thing hangs on, really, when you think about it. And I also was sort of conscious of it being Paul-heavy at the time. And, then, of course, you realize, he was driving the project with George Martin, and, John was in his acid phase, and George was in India in his head, and Ringo was playing chess. So, the results are evident, when you listen to it.
But despite all that, at the time, Sgt. Pepper was held up as the group's masterpiece. I mean, listeners in 1967 had no idea that this was not the Beatles functioning as the collective they had been in the past. They had no idea that Paul was the driving force and that George was sidelined. And it seems to me that in 2017, this 50th anniversary has sort of been an attempt to right the ship in the mind of older Beatles fans who maybe were put off by the idea of Revolver being held up as the greatest or Rubber Soul. I've heard various hosts on shows and articles have been written saying, look, we didn't care about Revolver at the time. Sgt. Pepper is the album that changed the world, and that's just the way it is.
And that really does speak to its rightful place as a media event rather than for the music within the grooves. So you could have multiple arguments. I never told people with my Revolver book that this should be their favorite Beatle album or this is the best Beatle album, because I would never quantify art that way.
Right.
It's all subjective. What I try to make the case of is it was the artistic high watermark of the Beatles as a collective. And I think I'm on pretty solid ground there in terms of all four of them being on the same page, pulling in the same direction, contributing to each other's material on a level you would never quite see again. Hereafter, you've got Sgt. Pepper driven by Paul and George Martin. I think part of what informs John's very vocal disdain of it in the years that followed was the fact that he knew full well that this product that the Beatles put out that was Paul's baby was getting all these accolades, and it wasn't his. He wasn't leading the charge with that album. And so that led him, just like he would always never miss an opportunity to take down Yesterday. I can't argue against what Pepper meant at the time it came out, to the generation it spoke to, and what it meant in terms of the media finally paying attention and saying, okay, rock is capable of producing art. And that's, the timing specifically, coming along at this point where, rock journalism, that infrastructure is just starting to get its footing.
Right.
By the fall, you've got Rolling Stone magazine starting up. Crawdaddy had already been around a little bit. Village Voice was doing great rock reviews. And then this was the point where the establishment media was ready to put a face on the counterculture, and they made it the Beatles. But the other big thing is that their closest peers, the Beach Boys and the Stones and Dylan,
right.
They're all sidelined for most of '67, and they've got the field to themselves. And you look at the most important and highly regarded works that came out that year besides Pepper, and they're all from newcomers.
Right.
From Velvet Underground to Pink Floyd to The Doors to Jimi Hendrix Experience, it's all these new bands that are, creating in their own way just as important album-length statements. But, if you really look at what it had influenced directly after that, rock took a corner by the end of the year. It was this back to basics, rootsy approach, that would be championed by the band,
right.
by Bob Dylan by year's end with John Wesley Harding, with Creedence.
Yep.
That was the direction rock went in after Pepper. And the stuff that did follow it more directly, it was instantly dated, and it was kind of a dead end, unless you link that in the chain to what became progressive rock in the 70s.
For the benefit of Mr. Cat.
It'll be on the bass.
Well, we'll have the Master Alberts on by then, won't we?
John had said in several interviews talking about the Sgt. Pepper era of the group that Paul would have a whole bunch of songs written, and then he would phone up John and say, hey, we're going to the studio next week, bring your new songs. And, of course, John wouldn't have any new songs. He was just laying around the house watching TV and not writing anything, so he'd have to scramble at the last minute to come up with material. And considering what's on Sgt. Pepper, it's to his credit that he was able to deliver what he delivered.
And I would point to that as example of, he would sort of derisively, in interviews to come, in a different context, not necessarily about Pepper, refer to the difference between inspiration and craftsmanship. And I see a lot of craftsmanship coming from him on Pepper. And, again, not to quantify art, but I would make the case that the most important and lasting songs coming from John Lennon generally fall into two categories. The ones that are this sort of Lewis Carroll gobbledygook
right.
stuff that he does so effortlessly, like an I Am the Walrus or Lucy in the Sky,
right.
or the stuff directly taking his personal inner life and making it universal. That is his real hallmark, because, such is the power of his voice that he can, project that plaintiveness and pain and soul and whatever you want to call it. Those are the best John Lennon songs, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at what he contributes to Pepper, he's drawing inspiration from the most mundane of things, and he's delivering something, and it's abetted, wonderfully by the production and whatever input from Paul is going on. But I wouldn't say those necessarily rank as the best John Lennon songs. Now, A Day in the Life is a different animal because, not only does the production rise to the occasion, but it really is a true collaboration with Paul. People think of it as a John song, and they think, well, Paul just contributed the bridge. No, Paul also contributed the key hook to the song John sings, I Love to Turn You On.
Right.
That beautiful thing that the whole song hinges on. And you got with that, whoever came up with the inspiration for the orchestral rush, whether it was Paul or George Martin, however that arose, it is a true collaboration between all, the chief architects of that album. So I think that showed when they were all capable of working like that, the wonderful things that could happen.
A song that some people, producer George Martin among them, believed should have been included on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, along with Strawberry Fields Forever. The Beatles, of course, with Penny Lane here on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. We're joined once again by Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez, author of the book Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll. among others. And he's here to discuss the Beatles in 1967. You know, Penny Lane, apart from being one of the catchiest songs ever written by anyone ever, it's
deceptive.
Right.
Yeah, there's so much going on. Penny Lane is a far more complex tune than meets the ear. You know, it's catchy, of course, and you got that sort of McCartney-esque bounce to it. But, you know, there's a lot. It's very impressionistic, and it's not all sweetness and light, you know?
Yeah. So we've talked about Paul's role as the chief creative force behind Pepper and how John stepped up to the plate and contributed as best he could. But the odd man out here seems to be George. Now, he was flourishing in 1966, but here on Sgt. Pepper, he was only granted one track, Within You, Without You, and two other ones, Only a Northern Song and It's All Too Much, were rejected.
That's very true. One of the things I found most striking when sort of looking at the way it played out is George comes from this real position of strength in the band. In 1966, in the Revolver sessions,
yes,
3 contributions, hair songs for that album, an unprecedented high that would never be matched again, for a ratio of a single disc, and the opening track besides. That's a real position of strength and influence in that band. And then, come the next album, he's distancing himself. He writes all the songs that are recorded that he wrote in 67 are written on keyboard, which is interesting for the lead guitarist of the Beatles. It's just somewhere else. And to me, I'm not trying to position myself as a professional Pepper basher, although some people have described me that way. But, it's something less than a full Beatle album when you've got varying degrees of engagement that is so strikingly different from what preceded it. George, certainly, he's not even playing all the lead guitar on the Pepper album.
Yeah.
And, John is being sort of pushed and shamed into contributing. Now, in the podcast I did on the alternate universe, second-guessing the Beatles, in my Pepper, I would have put All Too Much on there just because I think it's a nice... It's a rock song, and it would have fit in that way. It's got the sunshininess that, matches or dovetails with Paul's sort of vision and overpowering vibe. But it's also is speaking directly to that, acidy Summer of Love gestalt that was going on.
Right, and by the time it surfaces on Yellow Submarine, that's kind of old hat. Everybody's moved on into, stoner boogie.
Right. Poor George.
Shortly after recording that song, It's All Too Much, the group began work on All You Need Is Love, which made its debut on television on June 25th as part of the first live global television link, a program called Our World. Now, as I recall, the story is that Beatles manager Brian Epstein showed up at EMI Studios and announced that they were going to be on this program. John and Paul had no idea, and that they immediately had to get to work on writing a song.
And they put it off literally to almost the last minute, until like 2 weeks to go, to start getting serious about it.
And
at least that's the story with John's case.
Right, and I think Paul's contribution was All Together Now?
That there are competing versions. Some people say it's Your Mother Should Know, which makes very little sense.
Right.
All Together Now makes much more sense. It's simple. It's something that could be easily understood by no matter what language you speak. And then he calls it out at the end of All You Need Is Love.
Right.
So my money's on that.
So let's jump ahead to the Magical Mystery Tour project. Now, it was conceived by Paul mainly as something for the group to do in the wake of Brian Epstein's accidental death. And at the time, the Beatles were on such a high, it seemed like everything they touched turned to gold. So there may have been some arrogance at play here. We just got through making the greatest rock and roll album of all time, and we just released the anthem for the Summer of Love. We're going to make a movie, and we're going to do an incredible film because we're the Beatles, and we're just fantastic. And it turns out that they get together in September, start filming this thing, and when it's released, and it's released on television in England, it airs the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, on the BBC. And it's this roly-poly, surreal 60s freeform movie, and it is just slaughtered by the critics.
Right. And that, again, not to pile on all the negative attention the Magical Mystery Tour film has gotten. I mean, certainly it has its charm, and I would absolutely rather have it than not have it. But, it's so easy in hindsight to see the mistakes that they made in that. As you described, the arrogance, Paul driving this sort of perception, we can do anything,
Right.
We're artists, no matter what we turn our hand to. It's like, to break the rules of a given genre or field, you have to first understand them, and they didn't. And you just wonder, with the loss of Brian, who was all about planning and organization, all the things that went wrong in the shoot in terms of, they just didn't work out the logistics in advance. They were doing it on the fly and expected to contrive magic by assembling this crew of people who weren't natural improvisers, but that was what the Beatles expected them to do. And then you've got the whole aspect of, this Boxing Day television presentation on BBC. It's like this big TV watching day that you expect a little holiday entertainment. Something might be a little seasonal. It's certainly not that. But the Beatles had to have known that this would be seen in black and white. It wasn't the BBC making a boneheaded decision to air it in black and white. It was the fact that most TVs in households in Britain were black and white at that time, and therefore why create something for the small screen that relies so much on color and visuals that is going to be lost in a black and white screening? That energy and thought should have been put into the script or something like it so that it would translate to black and white. That was the golden opportunity served up on a platter that the Beatles gave the British media,
right,
where the media is sort of looking for the opportunity to take these guys down a few notches. You read the reviews now, and they seem to be really full of overkill, but it was like they were waiting for something. Now, what I found interesting is that year, between the release of Pepper and the All You Need Is Love broadcast, that's when the story broke about Paul's LSD use.
Right.
And it's hard to imagine, had that been the story 1 year earlier, how it wouldn't have destroyed their career. But they were so golden in '67, it was like a little speed bump.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
About 4 times.
Well, do you think you have now encouraged your fans to take drugs?
I don't think it'll make any difference, I don't think my fans are going to take drugs just because I did, But the thing is, that's not the point anyway, I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, on television. I mean, you're spreading this now at this moment. This is going into all the homes, in Britain. And I'd rather it didn't, But you're asking me the question. You want me to be honest. I'll be honest.
But as a public figure, surely you've got a responsibility to lots and
No,
lots
it's
of
you've
teenagers.
got the responsibility. You've got the responsibility not to spread this now. I'm quite prepared to keep it as a very personal thing, if you will too.
So as we start to wrap up here, it doesn't seem like we're getting a 50th anniversary box set for Magical Mystery Tour, but the Sgt. Pepper box set, as overseen by George Martin's son, Giles, was very popular, sold well, and it's exactly what fans have been clamoring for decades now. And I'd like to see the whole catalog redone this way with outtakes and demos, but like I said, there doesn't seem to be anything on the horizon in terms of Magical Mystery Tours, so I guess next year it'll be the White Album?
That would make sense, and it seems like Giles sort of tipped his hand before
Yes.
he reeled it back in about that. But, the money they've left on the table all these years is, of course, the full spool of the Esher demos.
Right.
That's something that would absolutely make sense. It would be wonderful if they decided to include in there some of the isolations that have been made available of White Album material that were, in full view of the public for a while till Universal stomped that out. The isolated lead vocal of Helter Skelter and, all these other great, bass performances and guitar performances. Those are things that make sense to put out there because why not? But then again, this is from the same group that decided not to give you Carnival of Light this year.
Oh, well, that's, that could be a whole, listen, if ever there was a package that you could slip Carnival of Light, it was the perfect opportunity to do it because you could slip it on there and basically treat it like a bonus track because from what everybody says, and there's not too many people when I say everybody, it's Mark Lewis and maybe a handful of people, it's not that impressive, but it is this sort of holy grail of Beatledom, and that would have been the perfect place because it was all around that same time anyway.
Absolutely, and that's the kind of thing where you're trying to contextualize, to try to get some greater scholarship and understanding into what the Beatles did and how they created their things. what better insight into their heads? Yeah, it's a 13-minute throwaway that, I would dare say that there's a lot of people that probably wouldn't listen more than once or twice to some of the outtake stuff they did give you.
Right.
So why not Carnival of Light? Because, historically it's important. It was being worked on concurrently with Penny Lane, so it totally fits the sessions. And I think, whatever you can draw from it, this is the Beatles trying to break every rule known to recording and crafting material. This is them, with our trousers down, as John might say.
Right.
Get that little insight from it and move on. Nobody's expecting it to be treated as some long-lost gem in the Beatles catalog. It is a curiosity, but also I think in historical context, it would be one more piece of the puzzle to give people a view inside what the Beatles were thinking that year.
The podcast is called Something About the Beatles, and I believe it's somethingaboutthebeatles.com, right? That is the website?
That is it.
Yeah, and of course you can follow along on Facebook. There's the Something About the Beatles page. And Robert has written many, many books that are available in many, many different places, but maybe your own website would be the easiest place to get them all.
That is true. Revolverbook.com. All the books are there.
And that would include the Fab Four FAQ books and the Revolver book, and maybe in the very near future, a new book.
Yes.
Yes.
Wait for it. Next November. Fingers crossed.
Thanks so much, Robert, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care.
Seen all the shapes around the studio.